Alright, so today we are going to talk about triggers and why you should just say no to triggers. So, first of all, I'll throw down a trigger and I'll go over the components of the trigger, and now you can give it a name. This isn't generally needed, but you can sometimes. Text is normally what I put in there is describing what the trigger is doing. So let's say if I'm counting all the units, I'll say it counts all the units. And then you can come down, you say the type. So ending triggers are just calling the ending from the description. The guarded by op4, blue 4, independent. If op4 are in an area and it's guarded by op4 and they spot blue 4, they'll leave their position and go attack the blue 4 players, and vice versa. Radio triggers are activated by once you are in game and you hit backspace, press 0 for reply, and then you get to choose which trigger you want to activate. So radio alpha would be the first trigger, radio bravo would be the second trigger, and the text is what correlates to what that trigger is in game. So when you put text inside the text part of a trigger and you go into game, you hit backspace and then you hit reply and 0. And there we can see in the top left hand corner of our screen that that is the text that we put into the trigger, and if we hit it, that will activate our trigger by radio. And you can see up in the right that's we put a hint in saying the trigger is activating. Radio triggers are generally best used for, let's say you want to put in the activation field to count how many units are on the map. You could then set it to radio activation and repeatedly, and then once you go into game, you could hit backspace, reply, and then pick that trigger, and it'll give you a hint of how many units are on the map, and you could continuously do that over the time of the mission making, so you could keep track of how many units are in the map. Next we have the activation, which is all the different sides, game logic, anybody, and the radio activations. So this is basically saying when someone walks into the trigger will fire. So if it's set to op4, if an op4 player walks in or an AI walks in, op4, then the trigger will fire off and it will activate anything in the activation field. You have once or repeatedly. So once will fire once and then the trigger disappears. Repeatedly, the trigger stays there. And when a player or AI walks in and then walks out and then walks back in, the trigger will fire again. And then you have the detection states. So you have present, so when op4 is present, the trigger will fire. When op4 is not present from the trigger, it will fire. And so forth. Detected by blue 4, detected by op4. So next we have the condition part of the trigger. This is basically the major part of the trigger. The condition part of the trigger is where the trigger is checking for Boolean, and so it's saying when this condition is met, when it's true, the trigger will fire off and anything in the activation field will fire, and then anything in the deactivation field will fire after that. The condition is always Boolean, which means true or false. If it's false, it will never fire. If it's true, it will always fire. So if I wanted to test something like not alive building 1, then the trigger will fire when the building 1 is destroyed. If we're not testing any sort of Boolean, then we just leave it as this. The next part of the trigger we have is the activation field. This is where the code is executed when the trigger fires. So let's say we want to run a script. We would write null equals execute VM scripts, because you're looking in the script folder, and whatever your script is, .sqf. Remember, you have to have the .sqf at the end, and then separated by the semicolon. And then your script would fire. The null beforehand is saying that is basically the handle of the script. So because I don't normally, I won't be needing the handle to terminate it or check if it's terminated or done. Next we have the deactivation field. This is the code that executes immediately following the activation field. The timeout is for how long. So let's say I have op4, I want op4 to be present, and I want them to be present for 60 seconds. 60 seconds. So the op4 would have to remain inside that trigger for 60 seconds before it is actually fired off and it executes anything in the activation field. The min is the minimum value, the mid is the mid-range value, and the max is the max range value, obviously. So let's say I had something like 160 and this would be 90. The trigger would pick a random value between the mid and the max, and that would be the value for how long the op4 unit would have to sit in there. In countdown, the trigger will pick a random number between 60 and 160, and it will count down from that number, and once it reaches 0, the trigger will fire. The main thing to remember is, in countdown, once a player walks in, the trigger will fire off in that amount of time. And timeout, the player walks in and you have to stay in that circle without leaving for the trigger, for that time, for the trigger to fire off. Up here we have the ellipse, so the size of the trigger. Now this is a crucial component because if you have triggers that are over 1,000 meters, it can dramatically affect your performance on your mission and on the clients. This is because triggers, one, they check every single frame rate for if the condition value is true. This is one of the reasons why we don't like triggers, because even though they're easy to use and they help with a lot of setup, you shouldn't use them because they eat performance, especially when you have a lot of them. So again, to reiterate this point, is that when you have a lot of triggers, they're all checking their condition statement every single frame. Again, this is going to eat performance and it's going to degrade your mission. Some of the common mistakes I see new mission makers make is they put tons and tons of triggers in. You don't want to do that because you want to run your mission at max performance for all clients. So what is the limit then for the amount of triggers you can put in? Well, I don't have a definitive answer for you. My recommendation is to put no more than 10 triggers in. That being said, with my missions, at most I put in 3 triggers, 3 to 4. The rest I do by scripts. Anything you can do with a trigger, you can do with a script. The other single most important thing you need to know about triggers is that they run globally. Anything in the activation field will be run on the local client's atmosphere. It will run on the server's atmosphere, and it will run on all other clients' atmospheres. So that means if you're running a script that's spawning units and you're not checking that script to run only on the server, every single client's going to run that script, and you're going to create tons and tons of units. Well, that about wraps up triggers part 1. In part 1 we talked about the components of a trigger. We talked about how triggers are global and why triggers are bad. In part 2 I will go into activating triggers for ground units only. I will go into syncing triggers to units so only a certain vehicle will set it off. And I will talk about trigger lists.